In the eternal struggle between good and evil, the essence of the divine, God, the greatest good, is embodied in truth, goodness, and beauty, and stands opposed by adversarial, demonic forces that seek to pull mankind away from the greatest good. While human frailties often lead individuals to lie, pursue selfish gains over justice, or attack beauty out of resentment, each compromise in service of political expediency nudges both individuals and societies closer to evil. Feminists, along with so-called anti-racists who propagate anti-white sentiments, anti-fascists who undermine freedom and democracy, and assorted anti-humans who can be found supporting authoritarian encroachments on inalienable rights, confounding, mutilating and sterilizing children, and promoting environmentalist agendas that harm people to appease predictive models that have never once been correct in their warnings of impending doom. Our civilization is in a precarious position, and it may not survive. But the ultimate war between good and evil has a foregone conclusion. And in the modern West, where the ultimate war is a tangible phenomenon, we seem to have a real opportunity to actually win our battle. The sex war was a critical foundation for the unravelling of our civilization and the ascendance of evil here. In Corinthians, St. Paul expounds the Christian understanding of the proper hierarchy of authority, saying, "Realize that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God." Another theme throughout Scripture is God's insistence that we must not be slaves. It was better that Moses led the Israelites into a snake-infested desert for 40 years than they stay in relative physical safety, but without the dignity of freedom as Pharaoh's chattel. The historical record supports the wisdom of the Christian hierarchy of authority for cultivating free societies. Physically, intellectually, and morally, it has always been overwhelmingly men in the vanguard against authoritarianism. The great philosophers have always been men, the founding fathers of the United States of America, Alexander Solzhenitsyn and Viktor Frankl, who turned their harrowing experiences in concentration camps into literary resources containing truly saving beauty, if we would but heed their words. Women rarely involve ourselves directly in manning any barricades, although appeals to men to protect us have been invoked in order to encourage men to make these sacrifices. Our collective prosperity and freedoms in Christendom have been an unprecedented marvel, realized by men and women who fundamentally accepted the Christian hierarchy of authority. But acceptance has been eroding exponentially, and we need to reconnect with it, with our God-given natures, if we are to protect our God-given rights. I acknowledge that my appeal to trad sex hierarchies is an appeal to understandings that historically enabled injustices for both men and women. I don't want us to return to a rose-tinted past. I want us to think critically and courageously so that we can protect what is good and make positive progress where we're able. And men's leadership does not mean that women are absolved of responsibility to think and express and contribute to the functioning of the world. It means that we also have a responsibility to offer due respect and support to men who are still accepting disproportionate burdens to protect and provide for all of us. I want to make it clear that I understand that individuals can be better suited to alternative ways of being, and I want people to be free to subvert norms. But I see no contraindications to the possibility that going your own way should be subversive. We do not need to reject norms in entirety. We do not need to refuse majorities their rights in order to offer minorities their rights. And we do need to be clear that both men and women are subject to Christ and to God, the greatest good, above all. I hope you'll forgive me if I proceed to generalize about the natures of men and women. In reality, it's not binary and it doesn't need to be. At population level, small sex differences can lead to huge effects on outcomes. The 2016 presidential election in the US and the UK's Brexit referendum were both very close. Had only women had the vote, they would have been just as close. But both of those votes would have gone the way our wannabe totalitarian overlords wanted. We'd have very little success on the street predicting which way people vote based only on their sex. But the variance overall is significant. From the differences broken down by sex in Simon Baron-Cohen's empathy quotient and systemizing quotient test results, we can make some theses on evolved sex roles. I believe that the reason we find that women have evolved the greater ability to empathize, defined by Baron-Cohen as the ability to put yourself into someone else's shoes and to imagine their thoughts and feelings, and the drive to respond with an appropriate emotion to someone else's thoughts and feelings, is not only in order to be best able to respond to infants, but also to support group cohesion by providing soft power backing to dominant cultural narratives, in particular by making our own families conform to them, so that they're socially acceptable, so that they can prosper. Empathy and agreeableness are strongly correlated traits that women tend to test more highly in, and both can be functional adaptations that prove useful to individuals and groups, but can also make individuals high in them vulnerable to manipulation. Men have evolved a little differently. Men are overall more rational than women, enabling them both to provide stability and to realize progress for families and collectives. This gives men an advantage in being able to assess moral questions based on defined values, less influenced by social pressure. The war on masculinity has threatened men's abilities to be the morally certain and confident and courageous individuals that we need, and the associated feminist conceptual rejection of feminine social power, which is necessary in order to convince society that women need enhanced political and economic power, also threatens women's abilities to integrate the femininity and masculinity in us in healthy ways that would enable us to participate usefully in the struggle for our freedoms too. Carl Jung saw men and women as typically presenting personality features recognizable as that of our own biological sex. But he also saw us as having distinctly opposite sex aspects within us. He called them the anima in men and the animus in women. At the time he was writing, sex roles were significantly more rigid, so the danger he saw was of individuals suppressing contrasex aspects of themselves, which would not disappear as a result, but rather live in our depths, out of sight, growing twisted and malevolent and exploding out when they got the chance, possessing us and causing dysfunctionality and neurosis. Men possessed by the anima could be hysterical, whiny little bitches. Animus-possessed women could be hostile, domineering hags. He advocated that individuals should acknowledge and seek to integrate our contrasexual aspects so that we may avoid these dangers. and so that we can actually draw to some degree on strengths that we possess of the opposite sex appropriately. Presently, we lack sex balance within individuals, with anima-possessed men and animus-possessed women, but the cause today is precisely the inverse of what Jung was observing. We're not victims of social pressure to conform to the expectations associated with our own biological sex. Today, masculinity is dialed down in men by subjecting masculinity to constant criticism and the threat of punishment. So more and more are anima possessed because expressing their masculinity is too dangerous. Women's femininity, on the other hand, is dialed down by the conceptual rejection of feminine power. So we see many women possessed by their animus because they're convinced grotesquely that femininity is inherently weak. The attacks on men that have astounded me in their diversity, injustice, cruelty, and also in what I used to imagine was an absurd level of misjudgment if the aim was to empower women. It's crippled many men. There is fear, there is uncertainty, there is hopelessness in too many men. There are men held back in their educational and career trajectories, good men broken in courts, often family courts, where it's ruled that their children don't need meaningful relationships with them, or after family courts fail to defend their rights when rulings are ignored by resident mothers. If the aim was to empower women, it's a sick and twisted empowerment that we have, one that can only ultimately hurt us. If the aim was to neutralize the threat that functional individuals, men in particular, may pose to the establishment of totalitarianism, however, or to hinder our abilities to pursue the greatest good, necessarily thereby tipping the cosmic scales towards evil, it could work. For more than a century, feminism has cultivated a culture that opposes God by opposing truth, goodness, and beauty. Feminists have lied about women's capacity for malevolence, justifying feminine aggression, certainly relational aggression, nagging, coercion, reputation destruction, but also physical violence. He must have done something to deserve that, am I right? Feminists have promoted understanding of mitigating factors in criminality perpetrated by women, recognizing the impact of trauma on behavior, for example, taking caring responsibilities into account in sentencing. This is not an approach that I disagree with conceptually, but I disagree profoundly with the differential application of such compassion to men and women that sees men in the criminal justice system treated so much more harshly. According to William Collins, if men were treated as leniently in the criminal justice system as women are in the UK, 5 out of 6 men currently in prison would be free. In 2012, Professor Sonia Starr found that the gender justice gap in the US is 6 times greater than the racial justice gap, with women siphoned out of the criminal justice system at every stage, ultimately ending up, if they end up in prison, with 63% shorter sentences. And when battered wife syndrome is used as a defense to free murderesses who plan and execute unprovoked and extremely violent acts, looking at you, Sally Challen, I think that compassion for criminal women has gone way too far. Feminists have lied about men, exaggerating the dangers posed by men to women and promoting gross misandric bigotry. And feminists have lied about power, rejecting feminine forms of power conceptually despite us being blessed with the ultimate human power, disproportionate allowance to choose how we live, with the generosity of men to thank for liberating us to do so. Claiming that men exercise power for the benefit of men, and claiming that women are disadvantaged generally in societies in which we are privileged in a myriad of ways, in order to secure more and more special treatment. How surprising is it then that this culture of lies, having been well established with feminists at that vanguard, has come to the point where many polite and otherwise reasonable people will insist that they cannot define what a man or a woman is. It is ironic to see many feminist liars now appealing to the truth, because their own modus operandi has been weaponized in ways that they're uncomfortable with. Feminists have rejected the good. In his 1913 book, The Fraud of Feminism, Ernest Belfort Bax identified in the feminism of his day a sentimental side which insists on an accentuation of privileges and immunities, a rejection of justice and equality, which is anything but good. There's always been a strain of anti-motherhood in feminism. Some of it is explicit. As long as the woman is expected to be the primary caretaker of the child, she is enslaved to her biology. The woman has to be seen as a human being, not as a reproductive machine. Andrea Dworkin, 1981. But more insidious have been the subtle suggestions that women have been drip-fed. Messages like, only a career is a life path befitting our dignity, and that biological clocks are a malicious patriarchal myth, and we can decide to become mothers with the aid of science at any point in our lives. These kinds of ideas have led to tragically misguided decisions for many women who may have lived more meaningfully had they been better informed. This is not good. And we have constructed a radical level of taboo around criticizing women's behavior, not only liberating us to be bad, but also liberating us to make ourselves vulnerable to bad things being done to us. Heaven forbid we victim blame. Feminists have scorned beauty. From Mary Richardson, the British suffragette known for attacking the Rokeby Venus by Diego Velázquez with an axe at the National Gallery in London in 1914, to the apparently compulsory practice for young women to make themselves as unattractive as possible upon entering the sisterhood. We've all seen the memes. Feminists have a uniquely antagonistic attitude to feminine beauty. Their rejections of virtue and human nature, as previously discussed, moral beauty and love, are further affronts to what is beautiful. We are on a precipice. The echoes of civilization collapse are in evidence. Increasing economic disparity, where a tiny elite controls a disproportionate share of wealth and resources, mirrors the concentration of wealth seen in past declining civilizations. Rising political divisions, partisanship, and the erosion of democratic norms and trust in our systems, governmental dysfunction and weakened social fabric have all been seen before. Declines in social cohesion, the weakening of shared values and societal norms parallel the disintegration seen in historic declining empires. It could be that all we can really save is our souls. That's not nothing. And right now I feel like that there's a possibility that if we commit to saving our souls, we may reap more immediate rewards. There is a divinely masculine energy that is in the ascendancy. It is taking the mountain view to see that we have been wasting our energies on concerns that won't mean shit when none of us have any freedoms, when we're unable to reliably attend to our fundamental needs, and we're not even afforded the luxury of protesting our fate. Masculinity is leading, mentoring, and giving courage. Despite the best efforts of the dominant culture, there is a growing appetite to nurture virtue in our men and women. It may be that today our collective reserves of healthy masculinity and femininity have been subverted to the point where we're not strong enough to resist totalitarian creep. It may be that we need the hard times coming to build the strong men and humble women we will always need. It may be that one day when we're all gone, the time will come for our people to reclaim their rights, with virtuous souls who've walked before guiding them. And that's a legacy to live for. But maybe we have the strength we need to pull ourselves back from the brink right now. In 2016, in the face of extreme psychological pressure, citizens in the UK and in the US felt the fear and did the right thing anyway. We rocked the establishment, and they responded with a reinvigorated effort to cripple our moral capacities, as well as a dizzying array of systems established or reinforced in order to keep us in line, by force if necessary, going forwards. They were expecting to be able to offer us some pretty real choices back then, so that they could defend the impression that they were trying to cultivate that we're living democratically, but I don't think they thought we'd dare take the chances offered. They thought they could bolster the appearance of legitimate governance for free. Showing them that's just not so was thrilling, but it also made it clear to them that if they don't want us asserting our values, they need to tighten their grip. On the other hand, the intellectual courage rejuvenated and the networks formed and strengthened over that period have proven invaluable for the resistance to the closing down of our free societies. Today, we Brits are on the back foot politically. Our Prime Minister openly drools over the World Economic Forum with their fascistic emphasis on public-private partnership and general despisal of mankind. All prayers gratefully received. The US is looking more auspicious. Tucker Carlson became the most listened to podcast on Spotify recently, and he exemplifies a hero arc that is in evidence in many people. He was a partisan journalist who helped the establishment manufacture consent for egregious evil, but he had the courage and decency to witness his own sin, to confess and to repent of it by dedicating himself to trying to tell the truth to the best of his ability. Partisans all over have had similar awakenings. The spiritual transformation in these people is visible. They radiate dignity and love. Carlson's unexpected new comrade, Naomi Wolf, has identified two kinds of consciousness that arise in two kinds of states, fear societies and free societies. She wrote, "The consciousness derived of oppression is despairing, fatalistic, and fearful of inquiry. It is mistrustful of the self and forced to trust external authority. It is premised on a dearth of self-respect. It is cramped. People around the world understand that this kind of inner experience is as toxic an environment as is a polluted waterway they are forced to drink from. It is as insufficient a space as being compelled to sleep in a one-room hut with 7 other bodies on the floor. In contrast, the consciousness of freedom, the psychology of freedom that is America, is one of expansiveness, trust of the self, and hope. It is a consciousness of limitless inquiry. Since this state of mind is self-trusting, it builds up in a citizen a wealth of self-respect. She's been ever more enthusiastically engaged in promoting the American project and restoring proper appreciation for the Founding Fathers for nearly 20 years now. In one of her books, she cites a letter Benjamin Franklin wrote to his nephew, in which he advised that your own reason is the only oracle given you by heaven, and you are answerable not for the rightness but the uprightness of the decision. The majority of the uniparty political establishment in the US are evil, but goodness is more powerful. And there's a cohort of promising individuals in American politics who inspire hope with their faith, self-respect, and uprightness. The recent Republican National Convention was wild. Unlike every other RNC or DNC convention, nobody had to submit any information about what they wanted to say before the event. Trump just welcomed in a variety of often anti-establishment people who might have something significant to add, and gave them total freedom to do so as they see fit. Several took to the stage to tell the Republican establishment that they are contemptible arseholes. It was beautiful. There is a positivity and an inclusivity in the MAGA movement that is so wonderfully derisive about how things are done in Washington. The Uniparty lies with such sophistication, hides their contempt for voters behind pretty, vacant rhetoric. Parts of MAGA, including but not limited to POTUS 45, may be very short on style in comparison, but they try to tell the truth, so they're palpably better to a man than all of the swamp creatures combined. Donald Trump's first tenure was imperfect, but his record for securing peace globally and prosperity for his citizens was exemplary in my lifetime. His choice of J.D. Vance as VP for his second tenure indicates that, God willing, the second time round could be so much more impressive. Vance's history of effective advocacy in the Senate for working men, the admiration for him shown by Sean O'Brien, president of the Teamsters Union, for that, the attacks on him by the establishment cronies is all evidence that Wall Street may be about to lose the representation they've become accustomed to, and that average Americans may have a White House that works for them instead. Authoritarians in Europe are desperately trying to choke the spirit from their populations. In France, they've performed a coup against the will of the people that gave Marine Le Pen's National Rally a mandate to govern. In Germany, the Alternative for Deutschland party, that consistently places second in popularity with the electorate, is being subjected to sustained lawfare by an establishment who clearly see them as a legitimate challenge to the system of unrepresentative democracy they favour. But there's Viktor Orban, Prime Minister of Hungary, who's helped his citizens economically, promoted the family meaningfully, even reducing abortion rates significantly, maintained the integrity of their borders, and pursued reasonable and practical dialogues with Russia and China. Giorgia Meloni, Prime Minister of Italy, she seems to be genuinely trying to serve her citizenry. Her effectiveness on managing immigration has been a little disappointing, perhaps, but she's promoting the family, challenging consumerism, and again, pursuing good faith dialogue with China. Robert Fico, Prime Minister of Slovakia, pursues moderately trad-left economic policies, border security, and is, like Trump, Orban and Meloni, the peace candidate in his nation. He survived an assassination attempt too, last May. I'm sure that there's nothing to see with any of these lone nutter-related incidents. The last European parliamentary election results were another sign that the propaganda is failing. Citizens are seeing, judging, and acting appropriately. And if our democratic rights are upheld, we could just prevail, perhaps. Regardless of any cause for hope, though, the reality is that the one thing that cannot be taken from us is the most important thing. In the words of Viktor Frankl, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. And there were always choices to make. Every day, every hour, offered the opportunity to make a decision which determined whether you would or would not submit to those powers which threatened to rob you of your very self, your inner freedom, which determined whether or not you become the plaything to circumstance, renouncing freedom and dignity. He discovered this from within the Nazi camp system that he suffered in for 3 years and that robbed him of his wife, parents, and brother. We can internalize his wisdom in more propitious times, if we are minded to. We need to prep, practically ideally, but intellectually and morally even more urgently. We need to cultivate clear and active minds, amass knowledge, for the sake of truth, in reverence to our curious human nature, and to refine our models of reality so that we can detect bullshit. What was accepted during the COVID coup proved that our collective credulity is dangerous. We all knew before that people need to be paid or have nothing to lose to take experimental medicines. We knew that people need to work, need to worship, need to see and touch their friends and families. We need to remember that information cannot simply be accepted based on authority. Human beings are specialists and we're team players, and they are superpowers. We need to nurture and respect expertise, but we're all responsible to try to at least be able to identify when the messages we're hearing are counter everything we've always known to be true, or at least accepted and generally reliable, in which case a little skepticism is in order. Morally, we have unparalleled access to a wealth of literature, films, and art through which we have opportunities to vicariously experience life in circumstances wherein men are thrown into alien environments and meet or fail the challenge. We're empathetic with mirror neurons ready to respond to witnessing adventures like they're our own. We can practice proper orientation in the midst of chaos and terror, and meaningfully hone our moral instincts through observing real and fictional heroes' journeys. And those moral instincts are more important than survival instincts, because there are things worse than death. If there weren't, man would not commit suicide, and he would not throw himself into harm's way to protect others. But he does both, regularly. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Therefore, put on the full armor of God, so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground, and after you have done everything to stand. Stand firm then, with the belt of truth buckled round your waist, with the breastplate of righteousness in place, and with your feet fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. In addition to all this, take up the shield of faith, with which you can extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one. Take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. Ephesians. Vocatus atque non vocatus Deus aderit. Called or not called, God is there. God is love, and anyone who lives in love is living with God, and God is living in him. Peace out.